Hello, welcome everybody. I can, tell some of the people who registered your regulars. And also we have the pleasure of having the Anant fellows who are national fellows at Anant University, young architects, designers, planners, health workers from various countries, from India to Ghana to Iran to Kenya, you name it, Ethiopia. So wonderful, all of you, that you're joined in. And Anant Fellows, a special welcome because they have to attend this and answer some questions too. So here we got very privileged and very honored to have Dr. Caroline Butler-Bowdon, a wonderful, very humble, in my opinion, scholar, planner, cultural planner, if you will. And somebody, the last time I met Caroline was at the Museum of History in Korea, in Seoul, when she was working with Living Museums of Sydney. And I don't know what I was doing. I think I was in Denmark at that stage as a heritage advisor. So Caroline, it's so wonderful seeing and talking to you after all these years. One thing good is that you haven't changed. I might have aged, but you haven't changed. You look
I don't think you have changed, no.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you think so. But it's wonderful. Thank you for your time. I know how busy you are, and you've been very generous, very kind to share the charter, which is posted in the chat box, and preparing a wonderful PPT, which I had the privilege to see. So why don't we do one thing? Why don't we straight away get on to your presentation for 45 minutes, and then we have 45 minutes of discussion.
Wonderful to be here. I'm really delighted to have got your message, Amraswa, and always happy to share our work. I think, I suppose by way of introduction and adding to your very generous introduction, I come from the museum and the heritage world, and interestingly, so sort of spent 20 years in that space working in art galleries and in historic sites types of institutions, and then did an unusual shift in some ways and moved to work in the Department of Planning. So I have led quite a bit of this work with a fantastic team. So I'm just going to move through. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I come to you from Gadigal country. I think it's incredibly important in the work that we're doing about place and public space to always acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, or the land on which I meet today, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. And this particular picture I really love. It's from Wagga, and it talks to a particular project that we worked on, and I might get to that towards the end, which is a kind of activation project that we did with Wagga Wagga City Council. Okay, the next slide, thank you. So the real question is why. I always talk about why in the work that we do. It's obviously of fundamental importance to know what's the purpose. Why are we trying to improve things? Why are we focusing on public spaces, and how we can sort of focus on more, as in more public space, better, as in improve public space, and then activate it, or the programming of public space. So I'll be concentrating on a handful of these themes, I suppose, in today's presentation. But our focus in the work that we're leading is, of course, about amenity and experience, and that's how do we create walkable, active, connected and accessible public spaces. Of course, it's about physical health and well-being. It's of fundamental importance in the work that we do. Of course, it's about community. Public spaces are for community, and it's where community connects. And it's about diversity of community. And then it's also about shade and air quality, and of course, biodiversity, and how we can increase the biodiversity of our cities with extending habitat for animals and birds. Climate change, of course, and the all-important character. And I'll talk a bit more about character throughout the presentation. And how do we use our public spaces to foster a strong sense of identity, character and attachment to place? Next slide. Thank you. So we work to what we did when we came in a couple of years ago into this new division. Firstly, a Minister for Public Spaces was announced. So he's the Minister for Planning and Public Space. And then what followed was a team to really bring that to life. So what we did first was we looked very carefully around the globe of what we could find that we could build on and how we could adapt. So we, of course, we looked at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and of course this one was really important to us. By 2030, provide universal access to safe, inclusive and accessible and green public spaces, in particular for women and children, older persons and persons with disabilities. And I'll talk a bit about one project in particular with women that we did later in the presentation. And then the next one. So what is place? I mean, of course, you all work with place all the time. You know, I know that you're all architects and designers and landscape people and planners, but I think it's always good to go back to definitions, and that's certainly where my team has started. So I'm looking at, we looked, of course, at what is place and how places are spaces that have become meaningful to people. And of course, at the core of that is that strong sense of identity and character. You know, no one wants places that are identical with other places. Everybody's craving that kind of distinctiveness of place. What are the diverse social offerings and opportunities for social interaction in these places? And how are they welcoming, inclusive, diverse, green and beautiful? So what we look at is the location, obviously. What are its physical attributes? What's its purpose? So that identity and character piece, but also place attachment, which I still think hasn't had as much attention as it should be. How do these places make people feel? What's the meaning and activity that people gain from these places? Then the next slide, please. So then we kind of worked up a framework within the team of a framework of public spaces as places. We like to look at the kind of four ways in of looking at this or assessing public space. One, of course, is environmental, and that goes back to some of those parts of the why that I opened the talk with. So the environmental, attractive, green, comfortable, safe, sustainable. The social, are they accessible, active, welcoming and inclusive and diverse? The economic story, the economic angle of public space is of incredible importance, and I'll talk about a few examples later in the presentation. So employment, local businesses, things like learning and volunteering, visitors and the rest. And then of course cultural. What's the engagement in these places? Are they distinctive? What's their unique character? What's the heritage of this place? What's the expression of this place? And then how does that all come together in that kind of happy, healthy, resilient communities? And then the next one. So public space in New South Wales, another thing that we did was just, we've done a lot of mapping and measuring. Obviously, there's not an exact science in some of this, but we've really looked at what's within walking distance of people's homes and how can we make improvements to that. So that's been a kind of big part of the work that the team's done. But first of all, we wanted to understand it and understand the the place of national parks, but Crown land reserves and a range of other things like our beaches and coastlines. Then the next one. And I was lucky enough just before I came into this new role of getting a Churchill Fellowship. And you know, it seems like a dream now, travel, doesn't it? But anyway, I got to go to about many different countries, I think kind of 6, 7 countries. And I interviewed about 50 heritage and museum directors. And what I really wanted to understand is the kind of management of these places and what, and so I'll talk about the kind of 6 success factors and how do these places move with the times and how do they still kind of adapt and change but not lose the essence of the place. In other words, what makes those places special. So I went to everywhere from the 9/11 Museum in New York to Stonehenge in England to Falling Water in the United States, and then a lot of less well-known museums and heritage sites too. But I interviewed, it was a very fast interview, and it was right at the end of my visit to Edinburgh. And I interviewed Adam Wilkinson, and he was one of several people I interviewed that were just amazingly succinct and clear and simple in their language. And he said, amongst many other things, emotional attachment to place is what heritage is. It's a network of memories. So simple, but incredibly kind of powerful. And I've thought about that work and all those interviews on many, many occasions through the work that I've done in this new role. And then the next slide, thank you. And then met this wonderful woman in Montreal who I interviewed, who manages a historic site and a museum, a really special place, and talked to me a lot about how you reach audiences. But she consistently came back to, it's the story of this place that grounds us. We constantly return to context and the stories of this place. We're constantly thinking of this place and developing new experiences and programs that always begin with place. It's that funny thing I'm sure you all find in your career. You pick up bits and pieces wherever you go, and you think you move into perhaps a different role and you think that won't be useful. But I've thought many, many times about these different interviews. And that report, the Churchill report, is online, and I will send it so that you can have a look at it. It's about 130 pages. There's a lot of case studies in it and a lot of quite simple takeouts and findings and other sorts of things. And the next slide. So this is a kind of slide of how we've been working and what we've been producing in the team. So I think it's important to say that the team I lead very, very happily is a very multidisciplinary team. I'm a very big believer in that, and particularly when you're looking at something like place, there's a lot of different types of professions that you need around the table. So I manage a team of landscape architects, there's policy makers, I've got lawyers, I've got planners, that there are some program people, there's some people from the arts, and it's not a huge team, but many of them have 2 or 3 strings to their bow. So and I find, and there are a lot of them, they're different ages, they're from different nationalities, and it's a very rich mix of people who kind of test me every day. And really what we've been aiming at, as you can see on this slide, is how do we do a lot of collaboration and engagement in the work that we do. We've really developed a strong mapping and measuring and evidence base to what we do so that we know that we're making a difference. Delivering for communities has been really important. So a lot of our funding is for local councils, but we don't just give it to councils and then step away. We work with the councils to ensure that we can get the best results for that funding. It's about obviously more new and improved quality public space, and I'll talk about a handful of projects. And for me, it's about testing and it's about experimenting, but it's how we can build that long-term legacy and how do we get that systems change. No idea is too small. What are the big ideas, the small ideas, and how we can be bold and really kind of push the thinking. I don't pretend that the work is easy, and it's been quite an interesting journey, but it's been a really valuable journey, and I've learned a huge amount about I suppose the way I work as a leader, and the way and listening to some of the incredible expertise across the team and beyond has really kind of helped help progress. So really it is about that being civic led. It's about how we can create that long-term systems change. And of course, at the heart of a lot of it too is how we can focus on the role of heritage, and it's a vital role in terms of the knowledge and identity at local, national and international levels. And you know, because it's part of my training, it's something that we talk about a lot in the team, and how we can help help others to understand the significance of it. And the next slide. So this is the Premier's priority that I'm leading. So a lot of our work sits under this platform, and it's quite a long, wordy priority in many ways, but distilled, its essence is about walkable access to great public spaces from people's homes. And so we've done a lot of that mapping, and as I say, we're measuring how we're making those improvements through parks, play spaces, you know, improved streets and a range of other things. And the next slide. So this is my other why slide. It's about how do we focus on walkable public spaces, in how are they, how do we connect them, that idea of connectivity, and creating walkable, connected, legible public spaces in cities. Once again, the health and well-being is at the heart. Inclusion, how are they accessible, barrier-free walking routes for all abilities? How do we provide places for community gathering and connection? How we might improve access to social infrastructure, services, shops, employment. The safety and comfort, we've heard loud and clear that safety is incredibly important to people in a lot of the survey work that we've done. Amenity and equality, of course, are incredibly important. And local character, fostering a strong sense of identity, character and attachment to place once again. And then the next slide. So a part of what I talked about was that we needed to find definitions. So instead of making up our own definition, we looked once again at the UN, and we came up with this definition, and really the three categories of public space. So open spaces, that's the active and passive, parks, gardens, playgrounds and so forth. Public facilities like libraries, museums, galleries, civic centres, and of course streets. And streets make up the lion's share, the majority of public space. And then the next slide. So these are some of the moves that we're making. I'm not going to talk about all of these tonight, but ones that we've kind of really looked at is what's the investment in public space? How do we raise awareness of the value? We've done that through a range of surveys and engagement reports and other sorts of things. How are we working with councils to measure that impact? And what are some of those ideas from the pilot projects to legacy projects? And also some of that policy reform that was mentioned at the beginning. Okay, and the next slide. So of course, public space has really been in the news. There's countless articles about, of course, during lockdown, where we are at the moment for the last 5 weeks, the only way we can get out in Sydney is if we are going to the shops for essential purchasing, or seeking medical assistance, or of course to do exercise, COVID exercise. So I live up the street from a river with a very long linear path that runs along it, and I go there every morning, COVID or no COVID, but it is extraordinary the amount of people who are using that. It's like their lifeline and their only opportunity to really properly get out in a day. And I'm seeing families and all sorts of people that I've never seen before, either walking, cycling, jogging, you name it, scooters and the rest of it. So how do we really harness the focus on public spaces being so critical during this COVID period for the better? And then the next slide. So of course we've seen this worldwide response to COVID, and multiple cities around the world have taken advantage of the situation to create more public space for people to enable safer physical distancing and support essential workers with more travel options. And tactical urbanism has been used as a technique, of course, to make quick progress by piloting projects to assess how people respond to these initiatives. and demonstrate their value to community, addressing both short-term safety requirements, but also the benefits of longer-term change. And it was some of these types of projects that we have worked with others in transport and elsewhere to usher in Sydney and in parts of New South Wales. So some of that's been about supporting physical distancing and the economic recovery for industry, small business and local centres. Some of it's been about ensuring our centres are equipped for people to safely use public space. And then the third one has been, how do we increase our access to public space by creating greater room for walking, cycling in key locations. We've also seen, many of these cities support their health and well-being of their citizens by repurposing their streets, closing their streets to private vehicles, taking advantage of there being fewer cars on the road to provide safe room for people to get out and about, be physically active without risking spreading the disease. It's also been that the reduced traffic has presented an opportunity, I think, for demonstration projects to create more walkable local communities, using their streets differently and increasing the size of other public spaces, including parks and beaches. And then the next slide. So these are some of the trends that the team have looked at and have been amassing different pieces of evidence and looking at what's been happening. So this refocus on public spaces, recognised as essential places, and rediscovering the local neighbourhood, because that's as far as we can only travel at the moment within 5 kilometres of where we live. That gathering places, that larger spaces and crowd management limitations, and that kind of risk management for landowners. We work with a lot of the major big park managers and others, and we've provided advice to them. Obviously, hygienic materials and cleaning standards have been important. What's the kind of tech to monitor numbers, new materials and so forth? How streets have become the new living rooms, and how underutilised spaces have perhaps been rediscovered. And then what's the social distancing practice? We've seen all sorts of quite clever signage and awareness, and of course the rediscovering of bike riding and walking. And then the next slide. So the context, of course, is that there's a lot of other people who've done a lot of work before my team started focusing on that. And that the Greater Sydney Commission have done the Pulse, so that's a measurement of walkability and other sorts of things in Sydney. The government architect have done these Better Place, Greener Places, Movement and Place, and Sydney Green Grid. And a lot of that material is online, so please look at it. And I've suggested that it would be great for the government architect to come and talk to this group as well, because she would have a lot to offer. And she's been behind some of these programs. Then the next slide. So one of the things that we did, we moved quite fast when COVID hit last year, and we've had 3 international sort of reviewers or a peer group that we developed soon after we started. Their Project for Public Spaces in the US, Placemaking X, and GEL in Copenhagen. And I noticed early on in the pandemic that GEL had come out pretty fast and was surveying local communities to understand how they were using public space and how they were responding to it. So I sent them a cheeky email and said, could I adapt it for Australia? And they were very kindly said that I could. So it was quite a simple survey. We've done it once last year, and then we've done it recently again to test differences across the 2 years. So we had quite a few thousand people did it, and some of the key insights were that respondents loved and valued their local streets. Safety in public spaces was a priority. Urban areas need trees and parks. Local economies, culture and community go hand in hand, and that COVID-19 has created demand for public space. Probably no massive surprises in that, but it's been really useful to distill that, and the community told us what they valued. And then the next slide. One other thing that we were really keen to do as part of our streets program that was attached to this was to really just hear from the community, the streets they loved, the streets that needed attention, just these personal stories, so that we weren't just looking at numbers, but we were looking at actual words of the difference that good public spaces, or where public spaces need improvement. And like the one in the middle is in an area quite close to me, and talks about how they love this street. The planted median strip with canopy trees, you know, is my standout street for walking and cycling. And just that difference of local and special experiences that might not be grand or dramatic or anything like that, but they have huge meaning to individual people. And then the next slide, thank you. So of the community comments, we received 65% about footpaths, cycleways and shareways. Around 25% of comments were about the safety in public space. The feedback suggests local communities have a good understanding of what their neighbourhoods needs to be safe. Trees, parks and green space add significantly to the amenity of urban areas, and according to the community feedback, large established trees feature in many people's favourite places. And in Sydney, many of the most loved and vibrant neighbourhoods are defined by the diverse businesses that form part of these communities. Survey respondents said that public space and local business have a mutually beneficial relationship. Other sorts of things we found were that 45% of people were spending more time outside, mostly to exercise or get fresh air, and 90% used streets or parks in their local area. And during COVID-19 restrictions, there was a clear change in people's behaviour, creating unprecedented demand for public space. And as I've said, it's unlocked this greater appreciation. 70% visited public spaces where it was difficult to physically distance though, and although 59% of respondents walked more and 27% cycled more, these rates were declining towards the end of the survey period as people were heading back to work. And of course now we're back, returned to very few cars on the road and more people walking and cycling. So there's quite a lot of material. That report is online, and I encourage you to look at it if you've got great interest in what people wanted to do during COVID in terms of local parks and beaches and foreshores and the like. And then the next slide. And then some of this was kind of, I've mentioned about how did you practice physical distancing, and where did you find it difficult to physically distance. So once again, quite a bit more material in that report if you're interested, but it was obviously it was often in streets where there was the biggest challenge versus national parks and others where there was much more freedom. Okay, the next slide. So I was asked to kind of talk about this charter that we've developed that is not quite finalised, but was a draft charter and has been on public. We've done a whole series of engagement in and around it. And it's about the commitment really to quality public space. And it includes evidence-based principles. You know, we did a massive literature search, for example, talked to a range of different experts about how do you guide the planning, design, management and activation of public space. And what we want this to be is it is a charter, so it's something that people we're hoping will sign up to, and that they will be able to adapt it to whatever scale, whether it's a small local park or it's something might be a much bigger precinct. But we think that the principles are probably quite scalable. And we were very, you know, having worked in heritage, I was very taken by the borough charter, of course, being something that you can use to adapt to different scales. So let's go to the next slide, which actually has all the different principles in it. As you can see, it's got open and welcoming. That's about ensuring public spaces are free, open and welcoming for people of all ages, genders, backgrounds, abilities to use and enjoy, with accessibility being incredibly important. That places are community focused. This principle is about public spaces that enable diverse people and groups to come together and share public spaces in a way that builds community, interactivity and connection. And it's also places that where the public are able to express their shared values and participate in public and civic life. And really that celebration of diversity. Culture and creativity, of course, is where we share our stories and values. And it recognises public spaces on country and should acknowledge this connection. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Should provide opportunities for cultural expression and for people of all backgrounds to connect to the history of their community while feeling included in the shaping of its future. I'll come back to local identity and character in a second, but green and resilient probably speaks for itself. So how can we how can it adapt and thrive in a changing climate, and how it can provide a network of essential hubs that bring communities together and provide refuge and escape and build our capacity to withstand shocks during times of crisis. And of course, it's about softer, greener and more connected to nature and the ability for cities to be cool. Health and active, you know, it's obviously about healthy lifestyles and how we can encourage walking and cycling. Local business and economies, it's about how we can, public space can support more dynamic and exciting local economies. It's about they should connect people to businesses and support vibrant retail and hospitality precincts. Our streets, laneways and plazas should support the local visitor economies by the kind of vitality that they bring and the difference that they bring. Safety and security, incredibly important. It's about how people should feel safe to use public space at all times of the day. The design, management and programming of public space. You know, and that's to do with everything from lighting to clear sight lines, signage, nighttime activations and the like. And this idea that places are designed for people, public space that's flexible can meet the needs. So how public space is flexible, fit for purpose and designed with an understanding of its function in its area and its adaptability over time. And well managed, probably one of the most important. Great to have public spaces, but unless they're well managed and maintained so that people want to use them. And then heading back to the local character and identity, this principle is about how public spaces have character and identities that reflect and celebrate what is unique about their local community. Many of them are beloved and are the places that make people feel proud and a sense of attachment and belonging. So that one was an incredibly important one. And as I say, we got quite a bit of feedback, particularly about heritage. And during the engagement on the principles, one of the key themes that emerged was the heritage value of public space, particularly in relation to one of the 10 principles, this one, the local character and identity, which about how public space reflects who we are and our diverse stories and histories. And the feedback that we received was the importance of protecting and maintaining heritage and history, and referencing often the Borough Charter as a key guiding resource, reflecting that all public spaces on country with deeply embedded Aboriginal heritage and culture, acknowledging that heritage in public space can be tangible or intangible, embedded in public form, in built form and landscapes, or living in stories, memories and oral histories. So we've been working through all these comments and we're planning to release the final charter later in 2021 and then really start to talk about it even more so with communities and other government agencies and the rest of it to make sure that the principles can be used and embedded. And there's a whole series of case studies and a practitioner's guide and other materials that will come out too when the Public Spaces Charter is released. So then the next slide. So of course, what's critical too is the work that is also being led within the department about connecting with country. And as I mentioned, this is being led by Dylan Combermary in the Government Architects branch, and how we can kind of build in that support for the health and well-being of country by valuing, respecting and being guided by Aboriginal people. And then the next slide. And how we can start with country, this idea of human-centred versus country-centred. Country is expressed and activated through cultural practice, and Aboriginal people's identity is deeply linked to their cultural connection to country. So designing with country doesn't put people and their needs at the centre, but by caring for country, it looks after our own health and well-being. And it's quite a simple diagram, that, but incredibly powerful. And then the next slide is really about just some of the ways that we are embedding that. So things like learning from first languages and place names, what are the mutually beneficial relationships with country, how we can understand pathways for connecting through cultural expression and dance and ceremony and performance. And several of my other colleagues are doing kind of really interesting things in that space. And then how we can consider life cycles of projects that we plan and deliver from an Aboriginal perspective or with an Aboriginal perspective. And then the next slide. There's a lot more detail in here, but there's a range of different principles that, once again, it's all online, about things like how can we prioritise financial and economic benefits to the country where we're working, and by extension to the traditional custodians of that country, and so forth. But yeah, I encourage you to have a look at it and call out if you have any questions. And then the next slide. I put this one in because this is one of these other kind of really important interviews that I did when I was on that Churchill Fellowship. And it was about accessibility. And it was really, this was Dr. Carol Souter, who'd worked at Heritage Lottery Fund and was on the board of Historic Royal Palaces and things. But she said, and I just read it, accessibility at heritage sites has been transformed in large part because Heritage Lottery Fund projects required it. By us insisting on it, it combined with the public demand for it, we've seen a shift in accessibility at sites. Of course, and this is the bit that I love the most, of course, accessibility is not about disabilities, it's about life. It's critical, it's about how we cater for an ageing population, for mum or dad in a wheelchair, and how you get a buggy in and out through to visitors with hearing impairments. And it was one of those statements that has stayed with me. And I think we see a lot of that in that charter, but how we can really start to live that through a range of the projects that we do. And then the next slide, I'll start moving with a bit more pace. Another one is this Henriette from Girl, who talked to me at length about it's great to have these great historic sites or heritage and other places, but really it's about how you connect them up. And that's through walkability and connection between places. And of course, at the heart of that, you need legibility so that people understand what the kind of shape of what they're walking between and to and the rest of it. And once again, it was one of those really memorable discussions, and how do we kind of really tell the story of the specific character of places through the work that we do. And the next slide. So one of the other things that we're doing sort of that relates to the charter is a quality tool, a kind of really simple 4-page tool that anybody can take to a public space and really do a before and after analysis of the place. And we started with these 4 simple questions with public space. Am I able to get there? Am I able to stay? As in, can I sit? Are there toilets? Are there kind of basic provision? Am I able to play and participate? What's happening in this place? Why would I want to be there? And am I able to connect? And then the next slide. This just shows it through a different lens. So we've started looking at a range of places and road testing it with a number of councils as well, and sort of beginning to build a picture of how it might be used. And then the next slide. That's what the tool looks like. It's been translated into a number of languages. It's quite simple to do, can take only 15 minutes. We encourage people to go to the public space, whether it's a street, a park or so forth, a number of times of different times of the day to assess it, and perhaps at different times of the year as well. So that's a tool that's on our website. And then the next slide. And there you see we've translated it into Arabic and simple Chinese and so forth, to just try and make sure that we're sharing as widely as we can some of these resources. The next slide. I'm only talking about a handful of our programs tonight, but we're leading quite a significant spend across 200 or so projects across New South Wales, some quite small in scale and some far more significant. Quite a few focused on streets, as you can see, and I'll show a handful of those. Some are more temporary, tactical interventions through to much more permanent works. And then the big ones, the Public Space Legacy Program, and those projects haven't begun yet, but we will start to see them develop. And then so we've looked at the kind of global trends in recreation. We know that people like to walk in linear ways, linear connections, so links and loops. They like places that are flexible and multi-use. They like to be able to express themselves, so adaptable places. Accessibility is incredibly important, and how they're easy to get to. They're close to home and they provide greater flexibility. And then the next slide. And so part of this was doing this great outdoors survey where we looked at the different districts and what people wanted to do. And, you know, what came out really, really clearly is what people wanted most to do was walk, 85% or so, particularly in places far from the sea. They wanted much more water. That was particularly in warmer areas too in Sydney, but things like dog walking was incredibly important. Just being out in green and park spaces was important. So we're just building this evidence to enable us to kind of know where to focus our attention to. Next slide. Just the next one. So one of the things too that we've looked at is everyone can play, the building of play spaces. So we're building over 100 play spaces, or funding them, funding councils to build them, as well as doing some demonstration projects. And this is quite a beautiful one paper bark play space in Parramatta Park, and it had very specific technical site constraints because this is an incredible heritage site. So the ground beneath the play space contains significant Aboriginal and European archaeological potential, making excavation and placement of subsurface footings impossible. So the solution was a raised no-dig platform which satisfied the heritage requirements and resolved access, and presents an engaging, elegant and playful structure, and I think is kind of quite beautiful in this treed kind of wooded landscape, and has become this incredibly popular place for people of all ages to be able to play. Then the next slide is our Parks for People program, and the next slide, where we're building 8 new big parks across Sydney. They're mostly in kind of growth areas of Sydney, and it's about how we can meet local needs for recreation. And then the next slide. So part of this too is working alongside somebody leading the Greater Sydney Parkland program, and this was kind of quite a big project in talking to the community too about what mattered to them, and a range of case studies and the rest of it. And as you can see there, there's caring for country. And then the next slide is you know, what people most likely to select. What they wanted was a focus on celebrating cultural diversity, came out loud and clear, along with what people wanted was more open space and parklands where they live and work. Then the next slide. A lot of this material is also on the website if you want to dive deeper into it. And then the other thing we're doing with these Parks for People is an economic evaluation of it, and that kind of the cost of open space maintenance, analyse the current attitudes and behaviours, including perceptions and actions that determine the value and priority of open space, and then also landscape performance. And then the next slide. And then this is Tench Reserve, which is another project that we're getting to the final stages of the concept design. And this is a really important, significant site. It's been this river landscape's been a defining feature for the landscape and life within the area for thousands of years, and provides the primary design theme and narrative for this project. So we're looking at a new river walk and cultural planting that allows people to experience Indigenous flora and fauna and provide opportunities for education and well-being, and how we can really embed cultural learning and education opportunities within the landscape as well. So really using designing with country, and working with an integrated part of the design team is Ballaringi, who've undertaken research about the Aboriginal history of the area. So that we'll need to watch this space, because this part will be improved and happen in the next year or so. And then the next slide, so I'm getting towards the end. Obviously, some of these are the policy considerations. How do we influence decision making at a local and community area by shifting the role of public open space? How do we promote public open space strategies and plans that consider the future growth and connections, and once again connection to country and designing with country. And then the next slide. Keep moving. I think I'll cross over that one. And then the last sort of section I just wanted to talk about was we're really looking at activation or programming of public spaces. So we've spoken a bit about the more and better, but this is the activation piece. And deep in COVID, I was aware that a lot of our creative industries had no real outlet, because of course all the theatres were closed. And so we worked with Sydney Dance Company, who are the most extraordinary dance company, and they danced in a range of public spaces for us. And of course there they are at the Opera House, but they also danced in Wagga, they danced in the Western Sydney Parklands, at Sydney Olympic Park, and a range of other places. And then the next slide. This is a kind of festival of place. So it's really a collection of resources and tools and materials, and a rolling program, so not an ordinary festival, but we've done a range of different things. Really kind of a summer night walks program where well-known people took us on a tour of their favourite public space, and once again that dance company project that we did, as well as things like the public space charter and a range of other projects that fitted within this. And then the next slide. That's some of the dance at Wagga on the left, about 5 hours from Sydney, and then of course at the Opera House. And then the next slide. And then this is the Public Space Ideas competition, which when people could come up with any idea, and we had about 500 entries, which was pretty wonderful. And then the next slides, I'm just going to whip through these last slides. We've been focusing heavily on streets in the types of projects that we've been doing. And I'll just show you a range very fast of the types of projects that we've been doing. The next slide, and we can move quite quickly through these slides. Just trialling different ways, using the street in different kinds of ways to create more places for people to sit and relax and play, testing different things. Next slide. These are some of the activities that we've given over street space for people to enjoy, and we've seen a kind of increase in the number of people using these places. And the next one. This is the Summer Fund, where we funded councils across New South Wales to put on activities to encourage people to come back into public space following the first stage of COVID. And the next one. Outdoor dining, a lot of street space has been taken over for dining areas, to extend that so that people can do that safely. And the next one. Trialling slower speeds has obviously been incredibly important. And the next one. How we can bring activity and to the streets, and some of this is obviously very temporary and was there for 3 months or so just to trial different things. And the next one. local media coverage. A lot of people really got into these projects and supported them, and we obviously did surveys and other sorts of things to prove their importance, or kind of gain feedback on them. And the next one, and this is one in Burwood, once again, a range of murals and other sorts of things. The community named the lane, they called it Unity Place. It's a very diverse area of Sydney. The next one, this is Wagga, where they've used a whole range of incredible murals and other types of activities and festivals to bring people back and to really encourage local businesses as well. And the next slide. And Kingswood, we did a big project with women, and safety was a really important part of this. So how we've created a kind of walking loop and encouraged different kinds of community activities. The next one. And this is the night women's walk, where really, as I said, safety was a big issue. So we've done a couple of these walks and listened to the local women as to what types of improvements they wanted. How can we make these spaces more visually attractive and address perceptions of safety? And so once again, that is online. And the next one, almost at the end, how we can support direct employment with different artists and creatives and others to perform in some of these projects. Yep, and the next one. And indirect local businesses saw growth in their retail returns and other sorts of things with improvements to streets. Next one. And really how, just how we can enhance civic and public life with different activities using light and other sorts of things at night. Then the next one. I'm not going to dwell on this. This is something we're working on. It was basically a digital interactive platform to measure what's within 10 minutes walk of wherever you are. And the next one, so it'll be a handheld device that you can find points of interest, and they'll be quite curated. And then the next one, I just wanted to end on this. This was something I saw during the Churchill Fellowship that really took my interest, and it was 101 objects across Edinburgh. Some were in pubs, some were in streets, some were in museums, and together they told the story of Edinburgh, and they were kind of your way into understanding the history and the distinctiveness of this city. And then on the next one, I'm not sure we'll be able to see this slide, but there's a beautiful film here that's really short that just talks about what this is. I don't know if it's got sound, but we can send the link. As you can see, it takes you on a journey across 101 objects and tells the story through those objects of how beautiful and distinctive Edinburgh is. And I was really taken by that. And this is what we've been looking at doing for New South Wales within 10 minutes walk of where you are. What are the kind of distinctive places you can find? So we're building that with a lot of local councils, which is going to be great. And then my final slide, we can probably move on from this because I am aware that we're running out of time. The last slide I wanted to show was the six success factors that I found from my Churchill Fellowship when I looked at a number of different historic sites and spoke to the directors. What made these sites and these precincts special? And the first one was this idea of not just thinking in terms of island thinking, as I call it, these kind of separate sites, but how it's kind of all connected up and how we make the kind of the richness of the precinct thinking. How do we unify the experience from what you find online about that place to what you discover when you visit the place? How do we consistently make improvements? How are these places, how do we create greater emotional engagement and attachment to these places? What's the program of these places, and how do we measure their value, whether it's economic, social or cultural, and how do we tell that story so that that then encourages further investment? And it was funny doing that piece of work to then move into this different role and really kind of still draw on these success factors, but do things in a slightly different way. So I am going to, and then the last slide I think is just the finish slide. Thank you. that's the end. There were a couple more slides, and it took me a little bit longer. I'm sorry,
No, that's
than
fine,
I
Carolyn.
expected.
That was fantastic. That was a holistic approach, total approach to transformation of place and the changes. And you give wonderful examples illustrating what you were saying. And we really appreciate it. I think that while people are formulating questions, please send them on the Q&A box, not on my WhatsApp, because it is challenging for me to access both. Carolyn, that I think that civic driven, I think the key message is civic driven, community centered, or community, that ownership. And
Yes.
while that community is also changing, because nobody's
Yes.
culture is frozen in time and they're changing. I think you put that in the last penultimate slide. I think you showed that seasonality and tailored programs, present
Yes.
thinking, unifying experience, constant site and business evolution. Nothing is frozen time, everything is changing. Measuring and capitalizing on value. I immediately start thinking about David Throsby, who probably is very close to where you live, and
Yes.
about value and culture and emotional engagement. I think those 6 principles are really critical. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. And we really appreciate it. I'm just waiting for questions. I think that we have a number of young people. One of the challenges is like you rightly said, physical distancing.
Yes.
And even World Health Organization apologized for using social distancing initially.
Yes.
But now everybody's using social distancing again. But, a country like India where caste system and all these barriers are there, social distancing means something people are used to based on caste. And,
Yes, that's a good point.
And of course, once upon a time, thank God not anymore, we also had in Australia boundary roads. Remember boundary roads? And
yes, I do.
where Aboriginal people couldn't cross them to come into city.
Correct.
And I live on the other side of the bar.
I hadn't really thought about that aspect to it, but it's a very good. It is a very good point. And I mean, I think this thing of COVID, of course, has made us all acutely aware of our physical being in space, particularly when we can't actually go to some parts too. That very, or for instance, libraries being closed for for quite a few weeks or months too. The very absence in our lives of those places, that they suddenly grow in enormous value, don't they? The fact that you can't visit them. And I remember speaking to the general manager of Liverpool Council, who said, of course, you close the libraries and it's where people come to go to the toilet. They use computers there. It's where homeless people can come. And, there's all these other kind of benefits to places like that. They're warm, you can have a seat, all these quite basic things that a lot of public spaces hold and provide that, we'll never take for granted again, I don't think, wherever we are.
Thank you, Caroline. Questions are coming in. And the first one is by Mr. Ganga Rautela. He was the Director General of National Council of Science Museums, who used science activities and mobile science exhibits to open up public spaces in India and elsewhere in the world too. He has advised in many places, including, places like Questacon and so on.
Oh, yeah.
So his question is, do you have any legislations, idea of legislations and norms for building public spaces?
Have we got any legislation for building public spaces?
Do you have any legislations or norms for building public spaces? So your charter itself is a normative one, right? It's aspirational, soft law.
It's aspirational. It's it's guidelines really that people can sign up to. Well, obviously we have a range of sites and the rest of it managed by state government and by local government, and therefore there's different sorts of legislation that relates to them, or different trusts and other sorts of things, if that's what the question is. I'm not entirely sure, but I think it sort of depends. I think it kind of comes back to the ownership and management of a lot of these places too, and it's understanding, you know, how the kind of network of these places and the sharing of advice. Like, one of the things that we've developed is kind of a community of practice across councils and the councils that we're working with, and that's been really valuable, where people are able to share, you know, share a focus on what it takes to manage these places and how do we measure that. So it probably doesn't really answer the question, but I think it's
I think in a way you referred to it. I remember when I was in Canberra as the chair of the Joint Heritage Committee, my challenge was mediating between the planning department of the Australian Capital Territory and the National Capital Planning Authority about public spaces within the National Capital Planning Authority's ambit. You know, and then the people who are accessing up from Australian Capital Territory, it was like the donut, you know, in the center.
Interesting.
It was a big challenge, and then I was commissioned to work on the reconciliation place in Canberra, you know, in the Parliamentary Triangle. So when I was drafting the concept for the reconciliation place, again, the whole question of public, who is the public, and multiple publics, the whole issue came up. And then you have the Aboriginal tent over there. So we're working with the 4 different families over there. This is, you opened up a whole range of things, Carolyn. This is just wonderful. And I think that the idea of the Heritage Matters webinars is more to open up issues and ideas, especially in the kind of pandemic situation that we are in. And you gave wonderful examples of how you're dealing with, you know, limited aspects of public spaces and access. In fact, how people are accessing public spaces more during the pandemic.
Correct. Well, they're accessing some public spaces more than others and underscoring the value, almost kind of too much. I mean, we've had examples where too many people are going to the beach, for example, typical Sydney. You know, so there's been kind of real challenges on crowd control and those sorts of things to enable people to still go safely. But I mean, I think if there's one thing the pandemic has done, is that it does mean that we've been able perhaps to experiment or do temporary changes. And we've seen that, whether that's in New York and their open streets idea, or Paris, or any of these cities around the globe have been able to trial things differently. And whether or not some of them stick, you know, some will stay, some might not stay, but we've certainly tried to work with councils to trial new things. So simple things like a car park not being for cars anymore, but taken over for children learning to ride bikes and scooters, and, you know, safely be able to move around that space. And that ability to kind of, do things temporarily. And as I say, they might not stay, or they might come back only 5 times a year, or only for 2 months of the year, or whatever it is. But I think it has enabled people to think about space quite differently.
Well, a librarian or archivist from Brisbane messaged me saying that this is fantastic, but the problem with the lockdown is they're not allowed to go beyond 5 kilometers of where they live.
Correct.
And to what extent, you know, I mean, I don't think it's a question, it's just a statement that depends on public spaces. But I think as an Australian, I can say within 5 kilometers, if you can't find a public space, then you're not in Australia, right?
Yeah, pretty much. But I mean, it is interesting about the quality of public space. And I know when Melbourne went into their lockdown within 5 kilometres, there was quite a few articles I read about, of course, you know, some areas have got access to great parks and great streets and the rest of it within 5 k's and others far less so. You know, so it does sort of sharpen the mind, I think. I mean, I know I've had to draw the ring around my 5 k's and understand, well, what could I do differently? How can I use this as an opportunity to go somewhere where perhaps I wouldn't ordinarily go?
And there's a question from Dr. Shastri, who was a museum curator in the US for 16 years, who just came back to India, in fact, where I live, and he just connects all of us. He's one of the greatest connectors that I know. He's so sweet. His question is, if Sydney were to become a World Heritage Site, how will you envisage public spaces in the context of international tourist spots? Because, you know, World Heritage is so strongly associated with tourism, you know, sort of, even though that's not the purpose of the convention.
Yeah, it is, and it's an interesting topic. I certainly, in the job before I came here, I worked at Hyde Park Barracks, you know, which is a World Heritage Site, and I know we thought a lot about its sort of representation and how we can connect it in to be, you know, my focus at the moment with public space is what are all the connections between these sites too, with walking at the heart. So what is the 1 kilometre loop, 2 kilometre loop? How do you make those connections across the city? So I think, you know, it's a good question. I mean, the topic of the visitor economy, of course, is huge across heritage sites across the world. And you know, time will tell how much visitation will return to these sites. I've thought a lot about the sites that I visited on the Churchill Fellowship and wonder how they're faring. You know, some where they were totally reliant on international tourists and, you know, only local, you know, and how that is needed to shift. Like I've been watching the Go Local campaign in London, you know, totally relying on international visitation, but of course has gone, you know, to kind of champion why people living in England and London need to revisit Tower of London, for example, or Victoria and Albert Museum, or whatever those places are, as well as theatres and other things. How do you rediscover your own city? How do you become a tourist in your own city? And well, we don't have any visitors at the moment in Australia, apart from, particularly not at the moment. So that reliance on interstate visitors is, of course, very important.
What's interesting is, I mean, I'm more familiar with what's happening in Queensland, that there's more community, you know, cultural infrastructure being built, like in Rockhampton and all these places. And also the Premier, before the last lockdown, was often encouraging people to travel within the state. So domestic tourism is not within Australia, but within the state.
Within the state. Well, you know, as we know, every state is doing their own thing at the moment. Those borders, one never thought about the borders between the states. But now my son, 21-year-old son, had his birthday on Saturday and I couldn't visit him in Melbourne because the border is closed to us. So it is that thing of how we rethink tourism and we rethink heritage tourism, and how do we encourage our own people to visit these sites, and that might be changing, going back to the kind of programming and the use of these sites. I think will start shifting as well.
Well, in India too, increasingly what's happening is people are traveling within the state or neighboring state where they can travel. Given you mentioned your son, there's a question that might be relevant. How do you encourage public stewardship, particularly among children and young people?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and it's one that we're beginning to think much more. So I think you've got to involve them in the planning, design, and the rest of them of public space. I mean, we need to ask children, more. We need to involve them in some of those processes. So I know that the Greater Sydney Commission has done quite a lot of work with the youth panel that has kind of encouraged them to think differently about the planning for Sydney. I know that we've done several pieces of work with different kind of youth groups, certainly in Kingswood, that was part of the project. But yes, that's a really big challenge, and how we can't just be people in our 50s and 40s kind of focusing on cities and planning and the rest of it and leave children and young people out. And I think, as ever, we need to involve diversity of groups in how we think about public spaces. And we're hoping that that's what the Charter will certainly encourage people to do, but that's just a starting point, to be honest. Yeah.
And
it's a great question.
Here is an interesting question. You know, I see that tons of data has been analyzed. I wonder if all the data has been analyzed manually or AI has been used. And the second part of that question is also, as you highlight the importance of stories and emotions, I wonder if you have a plan to use social media as a data source or crowdsourcing to get stories and emotions of general public.
Yeah, look, that's a really great question. I love that question. The reality is we've done a lot of it manually. We haven't used AI and other sorts of things. We are working quite a bit with Smart Cities team though, so there'll probably be more in that space. But we've done a lot on social media. I think coming from a museum and a cultural space, I'm a huge believer in the quality of the films that we make and the pictures and the illustrations to tell the story as a hook. And then we've kind of worked very heavily with our comms team and our community engagement team on things like social pinpoint. So you might remember that slide I had, people's memories of what they love and what they wanted improvement with their streets and other things. A lot of that was done through social pinpoint. So people could map the street or the place that they were talking about and then tell us what they thought. So we are using quite a few devices. We don't use, it's mainly through the website, but we're really hoping that New South Wales Public Spaces Near Me, we can really build that to be as interactive as we possibly can. But I love that, great to have the data and the numbers, but it's actually the stories of the difference that these places make, that, the emotion that talks to that place attachment, that no numbers can help with, if that makes sense. Like, you need the stories as well as the numbers to help give you that picture.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question and comment, because crowdsourcing stories is one thing, but how do you crowdsource emotions of people,
And how do you measure it? Measuring.
Yeah. Now, there's somebody who knows you, I think, Tim Smith.
Oh, hi, Tim.
Hi, Caroline. Love the talk with the New South Wales Public Spaces Charter, Principle 4, Local Character and Identity. Have you done any user sampling on what devices, platforms, interpretation media the public wants to see, to access, to learn about the heritage values or value of public spaces? That is not just what places people want to see, but how they want to learn about those spaces. Oh, he's from Tim from Heritage New South Wales. Okay.
Yeah, I better put the question back to him, I think. No, that sounds really interesting, Tim. We'd be happy to work with you on something, is the short answer. I think the charter is the beginning. Obviously, we've gathered a lot of information that has fed into it and has helped shape it. But I think that there's a lot that we could be doing. And I think it's an important question about the types of places that people want to see. I mean, I think there's a few things that we're doing in addition to it, like the public spaces near me, the curated stories and other sorts of things that might play into that, because part of it too is how do we get beyond the well-known and the places, that people know about, so that people can be encouraged to discover perhaps less well-known places. And apart from anything else, the diversity of places, which I think is incredibly important. And that's where the cultural diversity of places becomes hugely important. So happy to talk to you, Tim.
Well, great, Tim. There you are. You better get together with post-lockdown. But Tim, I'm going back 25, 30 years with Heritage New South Wales, and as somebody who was at that stage involved nationally in convening Arts for a Multicultural Australia and schemes like that, it's having those spaces where there are multiple perceptions, multiple values, because we are such a culturally and linguistically diverse country as Australians, and we have national frameworks for dealing with that. And I think this is where, so I forget now who was the chair at that time. This is when Serge Domicile was still alive. And Tim, the challenge really is multiple perspectives, multiple perceptions of those public values. How do you actually reconcile? It doesn't have to be homogenized, but it can be, the ways of interpreting these days, especially with the range of technologies that are available, multiple perceptions, multiple stories, Tim. I think this was a challenge for us 25 years ago. And now you have access to such fantastic policy frameworks, so much more experience and knowledge that we didn't have, plus technology, I hope,
But I think it's a big, how do we, when we speak to the head of Destination New South Wales, who runs the big tourism agency, he talks about the great success of New South Wales, and what we need to sell is both the natural environment, but its diversity. And I think we've still got a long way to really share the stories of diversity, and that heritage means different things to different people, and how we can kind of encourage that outpouring of places and get people beyond the usual places they visit too, or they understand. And I think children learn that quite a lot at school, because they learn it through the diversity of their classroom and the different family stories. And I'm always really touched by that I've got kind of great hope for these next generations too, that grow up in very, very multicultural schools and the rest of it. Like, I see my own children, and they've got quite a different take on the world than I had growing up in Adelaide, in quite a, not quite monocultural, but not hugely multicultural.
Well, I think, Caroline, you hit the nail on the head. My own children, with a German mother and an Indian father, both of us migrants, born into a very multicultural community, so they grow up, the diversity becomes second nature for them. They don't have to go to a cross-cultural awareness training program.
Correct.
And so Tim has got a comment here. So he's really happy that you say, let's work together. Great. We now have a new statewide Heritage Blue Plugs program to link people and local stories, and need to drive the digital component. You'll segue well with your work. So there you are. You've already charted out how you can all work together. So I wish I was back in Australia, So
well, you'll be here one day again soon, I'm quite sure.
I'm looking forward to coming to Sydney. And but there's a question here: how can a balance be maintained between the what is called here touristification of a public space and its use by local residents? I know that's a big challenge. Do you want to comment on that?
Oh, look, it's a really good point. And I do think that's where the pandemic has shifted things, because, of course, there hasn't been the tourists. But, there's always the it's a challenge, but I think that that balance has been completely thrown. So what do we want to take from what we've learnt through this experience so that we make a lot of our places more attractive for locals to visit as well, so that we're not only reliant on international tourism? Because I think that's one thing that has been learnt, is that it's really a lot of places were totally reliant on international tourism. So how do we encourage, the focus differently? It's probably not a particularly good answer to that question, but it is something I think about often, and particularly a lot of those sites that I visited, I don't know, who, that you can't just cater to one audience. Yeah. I think is really the kind of sum of that. And also those places that I suppose are overloved in terms of tourism too. What happens to them now? We've all read lots of stories about Venice and the rest of it in recent times. So what does that mean? How can we retain some of the that a lot of these places don't get overrun with tourism, or there's that kind of purposefulness in terms of what gets offered and what is the seasonal programming and other sorts of things that get offered, perhaps more for locals who might want to use that place differently to how international tourists might treat it.
Thanks for that wonderful answer, Carolyn. I tell you that there's one place in India which during the lockdown has quietly been changing things, that is Kerala, which a lot of people love wanting to come to Kerala. Yes. What they have done is they've gone from, these concentrated areas of tourist impact. Like, we often talk about Barcelona, Dubrovnik, Venice, and so on, and what they've gone is for distributed tourism because they're backwaters and distributing, infrastructure in such a way visitors are attracted to local areas in different places. Yes. However, everything that they develop is based on an analysis of local benefits, local employment. Yes. So people actually buy into it, local people, based on the benefits to them. So it's even before the lockdown is over, it's already proving to be so important that next year in June, Kerala government is hosting a huge international conference on tourism and leisure, but focusing on the kind of built environment, the kind of design thinking.
That's a really good example. Yeah, I'd love to hear more examples of, how they're kind of reinventing their mode of operation and the rest of it. That might be much more sustainable for them too.
You said it, much more sustainable. And thank you, Carolyn. I think that there are many takeaways, from your fantastic presentation. And we've reached the end of the time. It's
8:30. Well, earlier for you, 4 o'clock.
But dinner time for you, or post-dinner time. But
very good.
But all I want to say is that there are many takeaways. Some of the things that people in other countries where there are people listening to or will listen to the recording is that's civic driven. That's civic driven, civic responsibility, civic custodianship, ownership is a very central message. The other thing is that in a country like India or some of the others, infrastructure is built, but it's not maintained. And you emphasize that you can have the public spaces, but you got to maintain them.
Management and maintenance.
The maintenance. So I know it also happens in Australia, which is 25 million people. We're talking about 1.4 billion in India.
1.4 billion. That's right. Yeah. Slightly different challenges, but nonetheless different challenges.
Different. And then your charter is very useful. They got access. They can access it. All the case studies, as we said, online. New South Wales planning website, and really appreciate your taking time out and sharing. I think there are a lot of young people listening from different countries. There are a lot of ideas. Great. And Australia, we've always had the advantage of smaller population, greater public policy, more experimentation, more case studies, and we had that advantage. And I think sharing with the rest of the world the kind of things that we have struggled with, we've dealt with, and the kind of approaches that we've developed, like you've shared with us so generously. Once again, thank you, everyone.